What kind of secret could someone carry for decades? One so heavy it shapes an entire life, bends choices, changes relationships. And why reveal it here in Judge Caprio's courtroom of all places? Friends, picture the scene. The room is filled with the usual quiet buzz. People shuffling papers, lawyers whispering, the clerk reading names. Then a man steps to the podium. Elderly, his back slightly bent, his hands trembling as they grip the wood. His voice, when he speaks, is barely more than a whisper. And suddenly the noise stops. Every eye in the courtroom shifts toward him. The bailiff pauses mid-step. The audience leans forward. Even Judge Caprio, who has heard every excuse, every plea, every confession you can imagine, leans in just a little closer. The man clears his throat, but the sound betrays him. It carries not just age but years of silence, years of words swallowed, moments left unspoken. His face is weathered, but it isn't time alone that carved those lines. It's the weight of something long concealed. "I've carried this," he begins softly, "for most of my life." Those words hang in the air like thunder. He doesn't explain yet. He doesn't say what this is. And maybe that's the cruel brilliance of it. Everyone in the room, from the spectators in the back row to the attorneys with pens frozen above their notepads, feels the same sting of suspense. What could possibly be so important that he waited decades to say it? His eyes drop to the floor for a moment, as though ashamed to meet anyone's gaze. Then he lifts them again, this time locking on Judge Caprio. "I can't carry it anymore," he says. The judge tilts his head slightly, his expression unreadable, but his silence speaks volumes. He knows this isn't the beginning of a simple case. This is the unraveling of a life. And friends, you won't believe what he carried all these years. Because sometimes secrets are not just stories hidden away. Sometimes they are entire lives rewritten, truths buried so deep they threaten to disappear forever. And when they finally surface, the shock is not just in what they reveal, but in the fact that someone lived with that silence for so long. This man had come not just for a verdict. He had come to finally let the weight slip from his shoulders. And in the next few minutes, the entire courtroom, and you, would learn why. Judge Caprio, known around the world for his rare blend of fairness and humanity, had entered that morning expecting another ordinary day. His courtroom, though modest, carried the same rhythm as always. Names being called, minor disputes settled, the soft scrape of pens against paper. For many in the room, this was just another morning, another docket filled with traffic violations and small infractions. But as the elderly man approached, something shifted. There was no entourage, no lawyer at his side, no family waiting behind him. Just a solitary figure, moving slowly as though every step weighed more than the one before. His clothes were clean but worn, his posture fragile, yet beneath it all there was a quiet dignity. The audience noticed. This wasn't someone trying to charm the judge or dodge a fine. This was someone who had come for something deeper, though no one yet knew what. The stillness in his eyes betrayed a burden far heavier than the law. Judge Caprio greeted him the way he greeted everyone, respectfully, warmly, giving the man space to find his words. But it didn't take long for the room to sense that this wasn't routine. The man's hands trembled not just with age but with the weight of unspoken history. He shifted his stance, trying to steady himself, and then, after a pause that stretched longer than anyone expected, he spoke words that hushed the entire courtroom. "I've been silent for far too long," he said. From that moment on, the day transformed. What had begun as an ordinary session was now something entirely different. A stage for truth long buried, about to rise to the surface. The man gripped the podium as though it were the only thing keeping him steady. His fingers pressed against the wood, knuckles pale, his breath uneven. When he spoke, his voice was so low that the first few words barely carried across the courtroom. I haven't said this aloud in years," he murmured. The audience shifted forward, curious. Even those who had come only to watch routine cases now sensed this was different. This wasn't about a ticket or a fine. This was about something older, something buried. The man's gaze dropped to his shoes, then lifted briefly to Judge Caprio before retreating again. "I made choices," he said softly. "Some I thought were right. Some I knew were wrong even then. And I told myself time would ease them. But time doesn't erase anything. It only buries it deeper." The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but steady. "Take your time," he said. The man nodded, swallowing hard as if pushing back years of hesitation. "For decades I've lived with this," he continued. "People saw me working, raising a family, being part of the community. They thought they knew me. But they never really did. Because I never told them the truth." A faint gasp came from the back row. Someone whispered, What truth? The man didn't answer that question yet. Instead, he let the suspense linger. I tried to convince myself it was better this way. Better that no one knew. But it gnawed at me every day. Every birthday, every holiday, every night I closed my eyes. Was always there. A shadow I couldn't shake. He looked down again, his eyes blinking rapidly. His hands trembled harder now, his grip on the podium firm, like he feared that if he let go, the weight of memory would pull him under. Judge Caprio watched intently, saying nothing more, allowing the man's story to unfold at its own fragile pace. The man took a shallow breath. Sometimes I think silence is the heaviest burden anyone can carry. Because it tricks people. They look at you and think you're fine. But inside, you're still standing in the moment you never spoke about. The audience was completely still now. Even the usual hum of courtroom activity had ceased. Papers remained untouched, pens rested silently, and every gaze fixed on the frail figure at the front of the room. He raised his head slightly, and his eyes glistened in the light. I came here because I can't carry it any longer. Not another day. Not another night. His voice trembled but did not break. I thought I was protecting others. Maybe I was just protecting myself. And maybe it's time to stop. The room seemed to hold its breath. Whatever secret this man had lived with for decades, it was clear now that he had brought it here to finally set it free. And still, the question remained, pressing on every heart in the room. What had he kept hidden for so long? The man's voice steadied just enough for him to continue. It started many years ago, he said, eyes distant, as if he were speaking not to the courtroom but to the shadows of his own memory. Back when my children were still small, when my hair was still dark, when I thought life would always give me more time. The courtroom leaned in waiting. He paused, his throat tightening, then pressed on. I made a decision. One that I thought was noble at the time. One I thought would spare others. But it cost me more than I ever expected. His shoulders sagged, and the wrinkles on his face seemed to deepen as the weight of memory pressed down. I walked away from someone I loved. Not because I stopped caring, but because I believed they would be better without me. I told myself it was a sacrifice. I told myself it was strength. A murmur rippled through the spectators. People glanced at one another, eyes wide, trying to piece together what kind of sacrifice could keep a man silent for decades. The man gripped the podium tighter. It was my brother, he said finally, his voice breaking on the word. We had an argument, fierce, unforgiving. Words were spoken that I never took back. And when the time came to choose, I chose distance. I convinced myself that space would heal the wounds. That time would soften the sharp edges of anger. His lips trembled as he added, but time didn't heal. Time hardened. Days became years, and the silence between us grew heavier than any words ever could have been. Someone in the back let out a quiet sigh, the kind born of recognition, of having lived with their own estrangements, their own unfinished conversations. The man went on, each word slower, more deliberate. I watched from a distance as his life went on. I heard about his triumphs from other people. I read his name in the newspaper once when he won an award for his work. But I wasn't there. I didn't clap for him. I didn't tell him I was proud. His eyes dropped again, wet with regret. And when tragedy struck his family, I stayed away. I told myself my presence would only reopen old wounds. But the truth was, I was afraid. Afraid he wouldn't forgive me. Afraid he would look at me with the same anger I'd seen all those years ago. The audience was utterly silent. Even Judge Caprio, who had heard countless confessions of regret, looked at the man with a softened gaze. The man's voice wavered as he continued. And then one day it was too late. I received a call. A call no one ever wants to get. My brother was gone. Just like that. No chance to make it right. No chance to speak the words I'd carried in my heart but never said. He stopped, his chest heaving, his knuckles trembling against the podium. For a moment, no one breathed. The weight of his story pressed on everyone in the room. I thought burying it would protect me, he whispered. But all it did was carve out a hole inside me. A hole I've carried for decades. I can still hear his voice. I can still see the anger in his eyes from that last fight. And I live every day knowing that was the last memory he had of me. He looked directly at Judge Caprio then, his voice almost pleading. How do you carry something like that? How do you live with knowing you never said the words that mattered most? I'm sorry. I love you. I'm proud of you. I should have said them. I didn't. A tear slipped down his cheek and he didn't bother to wipe it away. The courtroom sat frozen. The man hadn't finished his story, that much was clear, but even this much had shattered the room's composure. The secret was taking shape. A story of estrangement, of silence, of a lifetime defined by what was left unsaid. And though the full truth had yet to come, one thing was certain. This was not a simple case. This was the unraveling of a man's soul. The man's breathing grew shallow, his shoulders quivering as if the very act of holding himself upright had become unbearable. He looked around the courtroom briefly, at the strangers who had become his witnesses, at the lawyers who had fallen silent, at the spectators who had forgotten their own cases, and then back at Judge Caprio. "This is why I came," he said softly. "Not because of a fine, not because of some legal matter, but because this is the only place left where his voice still lingers. My brother once stood in a courtroom like this. He stood tall, certain of his case, certain of his words. And I wasn't there. I told myself it didn't matter. But it mattered. It mattered more than anything." He closed his eyes for a moment, as though seeing the past etched on the inside of his eyelids. "The truth is, Your Honor, I wasn't just estranged from my brother. I abandoned him. I abandoned him when he needed me most. He was drowning in debt, struggling to keep his business alive, struggling to raise his children, and instead of standing beside him, I walked away." Gasps moved through the courtroom like a wave. "I told myself I was protecting my own family. I told myself I had no choice. But I had a choice. I could have helped him. I could have carried some of the weight. But I didn't. I left him to carry it alone. And when he fell hard." A silence more profound than any verdict filled the room. "My brother lost his home. He lost his health. He lost his sense of worth. And while he struggled, I prospered. I built a life that looked respectable on the outside. A house. A job. A reputation in the community. But every time I sat at my own dinner table, I thought of the empty chair at his. Every time I tucked my children into bed, I wondered how he was managing with his. And every time I looked in the mirror, I saw the face of a coward." Tears slid down his cheeks now, and his voice trembled. "When he died, I thought I would die too. The grief was unbearable, but worse than the grief was the guilt. I didn't just lose a brother. I lost the chance to make things right. I lost the chance to look him in the eye and say the words that had been carved into my heart. Forgive me. I should have been there. I should have never left you alone." The man's hands shook against the podium, but he pressed forward. "For decades I carried that silence. I carried it through holidays, through milestones, through sleepless nights when his face haunted my dreams. I told myself it was too late, that speaking the truth now wouldn't matter. But silence doesn't heal. Silence eats away at you until there's nothing left." He lifted his eyes to Judge Caprio again. "That's why I came here. Not to win. Not to excuse myself. But to confess. To stand where justice is spoken, where truth is supposed to matter, and finally let this secret go. My brother deserved better. He deserved to be defended, not deserted. And I can't bring him back, but I can bring back his story. I can make sure he isn't forgotten." A woman in the second row covered her face with both hands, shoulders shaking. Another man wiped at his eyes openly, unashamed. Even the lawyers who usually shielded themselves behind detachment had lowered their pens, staring at the elderly figure with something close to awe. The man drew in a shaky breath, the kind that sounded like it had taken him a lifetime to find. "This is my confession. My punishment is already served. Every day I've lived without him. My sentence is the silence I carried for decades. But I needed to say it out loud here in this place where truth is weighed. I needed someone to hear it. Even if it's too late for him to hear it, maybe it's not too late for me." For a long moment he just stood there, his tears falling freely, his body trembling with the release of a weight he had carried alone for far too long. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, the kind that presses down on the chest, that makes even breathing feel intrusive. People had come expecting routine cases, small disputes, forgettable fines. What they had witnessed instead was a man laying down the burden of a lifetime. And still, through the silence, everyone turned their gaze to the bench. To Judge Caprio, who now had to respond not just to the law, but to the raw humanity unfolding before him. For a long while after the man's final words, silence wrapped itself around the courtroom. Judge Caprio sat still behind the bench, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes locked on the trembling figure at the podium. He had presided over countless cases, but there was something different here, something that demanded more than just a ruling. At last, the judge leaned forward, his voice low but resonant. "Sir," he began, "I want you to know that I have heard every word you've spoken. Not just with my ears but with my heart." The man lifted his head slightly, his eyes wet, uncertain. Judge Caprio continued. "For decades you've carried this silence, this secret, believing it was yours alone to bear. But today you've given it voice. That takes courage. That takes strength many people would never find. A ripple of agreement moved through the audience, but the judge held the room with his steady presence. I have always believed, he went on, that justice is not only about rules and penalties. Justice is about truth. It's about recognizing the humanity in each person who stands before this bench. And today you've brought us truth, painful, heavy, but honest. He let the words settle before adding, you've spoken for your brother. You've kept your promise in the only way you could. You honored him by making sure his story did not disappear. That matters. More than you may ever know. The man's chin quivered and his hand came up briefly to wipe his cheek. Judge Caprio's tone softened further. You asked how someone can carry a burden like this. The answer is, no one should have to. But by speaking here today you've set it down. You've given yourself permission to grieve out loud. And you've given every person in this courtroom a lesson they won't forget, the importance of saying the words that matter while we still can. He glanced at the papers before him. The formal reason for the man's appearance that day, the ticket, the violation that had technically brought him here. He tapped it once with his pen, then pushed it aside. This case, Judge Caprio declared, is dismissed. A collective breath escaped the room. Some clapped quietly, others simply nodded, their eyes filled with tears. But the judge wasn't finished. He leaned closer, his voice steady but weighted with compassion. Not because of who you are. Not because of your age. But because sometimes the law must make space for humanity. Sometimes the best verdict is not written in statutes, but spoken in compassion. He paused, his gaze fixed firmly on the man. Your brother's memory has been honored here today. And I believe if he were standing in this room, he would not look at you with anger. He would look at you with love. Because in the end, love outlasts silence. It outlasts mistakes. It outlasts regret. The man bowed his head, a sob escaping his lips. The audience rose to their feet, some applauding, others simply standing in respect. Judge Caprio gave a single nod, then raised his gavel. Case dismissed, he repeated softly. The sound of the gavel echoed like a release, final yet freeing, as if the courtroom itself exhaled. And in that moment, everyone understood, this was not just a verdict. It was a benediction. As the last echo of the gavel faded, the courtroom did not immediately return to routine. People remained standing, some clapping softly, others too overcome to move. What they had witnessed was not just another case, not just another ruling, it was the release of a man's lifetime of silence. Friends, what makes this story unforgettable isn't only the confession. It's what it reveals about the human heart. How many of us carry words we've never spoken? How many of us live with regrets, replaying arguments, remembering moments where we could have chosen kindness but didn't? Silence may protect us in the moment, but in the long years that follow, it becomes a prison. The man who stood before Judge Caprio was not a criminal, not someone seeking loopholes in the law. He was a human being who had been carrying the crushing weight of estrangement, regret, and unspoken love for decades. His courage wasn't in hiding the secret all that time. His courage was in finally breaking the silence, in standing vulnerable in front of strangers and saying what had haunted him every single day. And Judge Caprio, he showed us why people across the world respect him. He could have stuck to the docket, treated the man like just another case to move along. Instead, he leaned into the silence, he listened, and he delivered not only a verdict but compassion. He reminded everyone in that room, and everyone watching now, that the law serves people, not the other way around. This case wasn't about fines or technicalities. It was about dignity. It was about validating a man's pain, acknowledging that carrying a secret alone for so long is a punishment harsher than any court could ever deliver. By dismissing the case with respect and mercy, Judge Caprio gave that man something more powerful than freedom from a fine. He gave him permission to forgive himself. Think about it. How often do we wait for the perfect time to say the words that matter? How often do we put off an apology, a confession, a simple, I love you, convincing ourselves we'll have more time? But as this story showed, time is never guaranteed. And when it runs out, we're left carrying the weight of silence. Friends, maybe this is the lesson we need to take with us. Speak now. Forgive now. Call the person you've been avoiding. Write the letter you've been putting off. Show up before the chance is gone. Because silence might feel safer, but spoken truth can heal wounds you didn't even realize were still open. And here's what I want to ask you. If you had been there that day listening to this man pour out his heart, what would you have said to him when it was over? Would you have placed a hand on his shoulder? Would you have told him his brother would be proud? Would you have simply said, "You are not alone"? Tell us in the comments. Share your words, your thoughts, your own stories. Because someone watching right now may be carrying a silence of their own, and your words might be exactly what they need to hear. If this story touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to speak. Share it with someone who's carrying a burden you can't see. Because sometimes the act of sharing a story is the first step to healing. That elderly man walked out of the courtroom lighter than he had entered, not because his past had changed, but because his silence had ended. And that is something all of us can learn from. The weight we carry doesn't have to be ours forever. And in our next episode, friends, another story will unfold. One so unexpected, so deeply human, that even Judge Caprio himself was left speechless. Trust me, you will not want to miss what happens next.